Today on Twin Cam, we're at one of my favourite car shows of the year, the Lancaster Insurance Classic Motor Show at the NEC in Birmingham. At the weekend, we looked at the setup day and our drive in a little MG Metro, but in this one, we're getting into the show itself. So this isn't going to be a comprehensive look at the show, but just a selection of my favourites. So let's begin on the Metro Owners Club stand with this Mark I Austin Metro Vanden Plas. The Mark I Metro was always a very basic car. It had a utilitarian appearance, a utilitarian dashboard and, outside the accessories, quite basic trim as well. But for 1982, the posh Vanden Plas was brought in. At the centre of it, there isn't too much exotica about the VP, but it has all you could really wish for in a Super Mini in 1982. A stereo radio cassette, a cigarette lighter, rear wash wipe and a tachometer. But this one's positively aristocratic with an automatic gearbox. It even has 4 speeds. And to go with it are the trimmings that make the Vanden Plas special. All the wood, the better fabrics and fabric door cards, the padded head restraints, the brown plastics and the copious VP badges everywhere. And just to cap it off, it's in opaline green metallic, one of my favourite 1980s colours. But the car the Metro really replaced didn't have an immediate preceding luxury version. Instead, the Mini was naturally sporting, and in the decade before, the top of the range was the Mini 1275 GT. The Mini Cooper was discontinued in 1971, and to cover that, BL launched the GT, a hot version of the facelifted Mini Clubman, with that square front end styled by Roy Haynes, fresh from doing the Mark II Cortina, and some cool badges, cool decals, row-style wheels, and a single carburettor fitted to a 1275cc A-series, producing only 60 odd brake horsepower, but that's still more than the standard Cooper. And this era of Minis is my favourite. The Mark III is just very simple in its appearance, and despite lacking the provenance of a Cooper, I'd have a GT. There's just something to the decals and the angular Clubman nose. Back in period, the Cooper name was special. They were homologation specials that were rarely seen in the hordes of Minis darting and whining about the streets. But when the modern R50 Mini was launched in 2001, that all changed. They'd already become a basic trim level in the 90s, but here it formed the majority of Mini sales. And despite the remaining controversy surrounding the status of these cars, they're now 21 years old. They're a classic in their own right, and a design classic at that. Frank Stephenson must go down as one of the great designers, as outside of the exotic stuff, he styled these Minis and the new Fiat 500, 2 retro designs that are utterly timeless. You could still sell this car today because it's still fresh. This particular car, however, is quite special. Not only because it's a very early car on a Y plate, but because it's an OBL, which means it's a press car from the Mini's launch, a year or so after BMW dumped Rover and took Mini under their wing. The R50 was BMW's first small car in decades, but ironically, having bought Rover in 1994, they bought the company that designed their first ever car. The Dixie of 1928 was a licensed version of the little Austin 7, one of the cars that got Britain moving and one that's about to celebrate its 100th birthday. For Austin, the 7 was a departure because before this they'd only built big and expensive cars. But this was small, affordable and the car that Britons recall from the 1920s and 30s. Such power it had that when the Austin A30 was launched in 1952, it was initially badged as the 7, and the Mini, too, in 59, was itself badged as the Austin 7. But the BMW wasn't the only rebadging of an Austin, because the car was also built in Japan as one of Nissan's first cars. So this little thing is responsible for the success of Britain's historically biggest car company and 2 of the world's biggest car manufacturers. And one of the most successful and iconic cars that Munich company would go on to produce was the E30 M3. Without even mentioning the motorsport element, Klaus Luther's styling was impeccable, because the E30 does everything you traditionally want a BMW to do. It's characterful and purposeful while remaining perfectly elegant. Their modern styling teams could learn a lot, but the E30 was also just a brilliant car, and it was genuinely premium in its day. Then add to that a proper homologation special. The M3 was designed to race in DTM, the German Touring Car Championship, so this isn't just a normal 3 Series with a big engine. Instead, this sport evolution only has a 4-cylinder engine, but it displaces 2500cc and produces 235 brake horsepower at 7000 RPM. Overall, the M3 has little in common with a run-of-the-mill E30. Even the majority of the body panels are different, with flared arches and the famous boot lid. For the sake of aero, they engineered a new rear window panel and boot lid, and you can tell this by how tacked on the entire rear end looks. This is one of the most successful racing cars of all time. Through the generations, the M3 became more and more normal. But the E30's success maintained its meaning, and though commonality did come, the cars themselves were still brilliant. And for many, the zenith was the E46 M3. And this one's right next to that E30, showing in shocking detail just how big the 3 Series became. Because though the 46 is still relatively small, it's a lot bigger than the 30. I love this one because the E46 was the M3 of my childhood, and this was always the colour. The weird babysit green that was controversial in period, but seems to have aged eerily well. Unlike the 30, the E46 has a 3.2 litre straight 6, the S54, producing 338 brake horsepower in all its aural beauty. For me, the E46 is the last of the truly great BMWs, because after this they became ugly, lacked the correct number of cylinders, or became watered down to silly levels. There's something about the E46 that becomes more attractive by the day. The M3 has steadily become the most desirable super saloon in Britain, but before BMW were on anybody's radar, that saloon was something that, at its most basic level, was a lot more attainable. In 1962, Ford launched the Cortina, a car that would become Britain's favourite. But within a year of its launch, Lotus got its hands on the car and produced a motorsport legend. What started as a deal regarding Ford's Kent engine snowballed into an homologation special Cortina, with a twin-cam engine, 105 brake horsepower, a new gearbox, new brakes, and radically revised suspension. So radical in fact that Lotus binned the cart springs in favour of some proper coil springs at the back. But the vibe of the Lotus Cortina is what makes it for the casual observer. The Cortina is an example of how just getting the styling right can instantly propel a car's desirability into the gods. And the Lotus versions added their own, now iconic livery, with the cream paintwork and green accents marking it as unique compared to any other saloon car of its era. The Mark I Cortina may have set the template, but it wasn't the one that became Britain's favourite. That job would be closer to realisation with its successor, the Mark II Cortina, and it's here we return to the work of Roy Haynes. I'm sure you can see the front end resemblance with the Mini from earlier. But the Lotus was a very special Cortina, unavailable to 99% of Brits, so the one that took the attainable cool saloon title was the Cortina 1600E, standing for Executive. A few months ago on TwinCam, we looked at BMC's Landcrab for a lesson on how not to make a car desirable, using these Mark II Cortinas as the bar for success, and it's easy to see why. First of all, it looks brilliant. The proportions are spot on. Then there are the external trimmings like the badges, the row-style wheels, the black rear panel and the Ford trademark driving lamps. Then inside we have a wooden dashboard and a whole array of instruments, including a tachometer. It might not actually be anything special, but the styling and marketing made the 1600E the dream family car for so many kids in the late 1960s. But back to the Lotus thing, and Fords weren't the only cars to receive that treatment, as 15 years later they did it again. In 1977, Chrysler Europe launched the Sunbeam, a car designed to compete against the array of new superminis from all corners of the continent. But in reality, they were in such a perilous position that it was merely a rebodied Avenger, a rear-drive saloon car dating back to 1970. After being sold to Peugeot, the newly named Talbot Sunbeam was given a hot version, the TI. But they then got in touch with Lotus for them to do something much more dramatic and make the Sunbeam competitive on the rally stage. Hethel stiffened everything up and fitted their own 16-valve engine, essentially the same one fitted to the Esprit, giving the little Sunbeam 150 brake horsepower, putting it leagues ahead of most other cars in its class, but allowing it to make use of its rear-drive platform. The Talbot Sunbeam Lotus winning the World Rally Championship in 1981. A minute ago I mentioned the Sunbeam TI, and just like the car itself, that was essentially a renewed version of the hot Avenger, the Tiger. These things competed with cars like the Cortina, and in my opinion, they're a little bit cooler, just because they're rarer, and something of an alternative choice. The Tiger was made by two key components. First, the normal 1500cc engine was given twin Webers, pumping out 93 brake horsepower. But for me, it's all about the style. A little like the Lotus Cortina, the Tiger is famous for its orange paintwork, with black bonnet and bold decals on the rear quarters. Oh, and the famous hockey stick rear lamps. If you're wondering, the name Tiger comes from the old Sunbeam Tiger, a V8 version of the group's sports car. No relation to the later Talbot Sunbeam. This roots/Chrysler Europe history is a bit confusing at times. But the non-V8 version of the sports car was this, the Sunbeam Alpine. But this isn't just any Alpine. A normal Alpine was a convertible, but this one, clearly, is a coupe, known as the Harrington Alpine, built by the coach builders Thomas Harrington. Sorry for the lack of a wide shot here, but by this point the show had opened and there were people everywhere. But I really like the look of this. The Sunbeam is a great looking car anyway, but I think the Harrington conversion takes it to another level. It's brilliantly slick. According to the info board next to the car, the conversion also included the car being tuned by Hartwell. The Stage 1 tune giving 88 brake horsepower, with gas-flowed ports and manifolds, and the Stage 3 producing 98 brake horsepower, thanks to engine balancing, lightened pistons and rods, a higher compression ratio, a new camshaft, an exhaust, an inlet, and a new carburettor. Our final car today is another from the Roots stable. My favourite of the bunch, and a car that is really getting some love now, the gorgeous little Hillman Imp. There are a number of Imps on display, some of which are pretty racy, but this one's my pick for reasons I can't really explain. I just love the vibe of this one. Not too flashy, but quite classy in its sports spec, with the 4-spoke alloy wheels, driving lamps, decal down the side, and of course, the lovely big flaps. Yeah, Imps are class. Love them. But as I'm sure most of you know, I'd still have a Mini. But the Imp was just that, a competitor to the Austin Mini. But it went about its packaging in a totally different way. In order to save money, Roots decided to shun the transverse engine front drive isogonist layout and instead go for a longitudinal engine thrown way out at the back, driving the rear wheels. This has both its advantages and disadvantages, one of the latter being their propensity to overheat due to the cooling system design. But it's great to have such a variety between these two cars. Totally different ways of producing a tiny family car. I'll own one of these someday. But on that note, thank you very much for watching this first part of our gander round the NEC. At the weekend there'll be another one, so be sure to click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well, just to make sure you catch it. If you fancy it, I also have a Patreon, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll see you all in a few days.